All right, so today we're going to dive into something kind of wild.
Okay.
The idea that the way we think isn't just, locked up inside our brains.
Interesting.
We're going to explore how your body, the spaces that you're in, even the people you're with play a role in like how well you focus, how much you understand, and even how you come up with new ideas. I mean,
Yeah.
you've shared a bunch of articles and notes, and there's this central theme that pops out, this idea of the extended mind. Our mission today is to unpack that concept and see if we can actually use it to, think more clearly and learn more without feeling overwhelmed.
Exactly. And the research you've gathered really challenges the idea that intelligence is something purely inside the skull.
Right.
You've got stuff from cognitive science to psychology to neuroscience to even philosophy.
Wow.
And it's interesting to see how these different fields are all pointing towards the idea that maybe we've been thinking about intelligence a little too narrowly. What's really compelling is how they converge on this idea that by actually engaging with our bodies, with our surroundings, and with other people, we can really kind of unlock these surprising cognitive advantages.
Yeah, and this is especially relevant, I think, for you, given your interest in kind of like getting knowledge quickly, thoroughly, like this extended mind idea has some really practical advice, I think, for becoming better informed.
Yeah.
And, having more of those aha moments by using resources that maybe you haven't even thought about before.
Right.
So one of the first things that kind of jumped out at me in all this stuff was that,
Yeah.
we're always being told to just use your head,
Mm-hmm.
but that might actually be kind of holding us back.
What's really interesting is there's more and more research suggesting that we can actually over-rely on our brains
Feeling.
and that can actually sometimes get in the way of thinking clearly.
Huh.
So the alternative is to really think about how to skillfully involve things outside of our heads.
Yeah.
Like, the things that you highlighted, your sources, things like our physical sensations,
Okay.
our movements,
Yeah.
the spaces we learn and work in, the interactions we have with others.
I see.
Like these things can be incredibly valuable for supporting our thinking.
Right. It's like we
Yeah.
tend to think about these things like our body, the environment, relationships, but maybe the real power is in thinking with them,
Like through them.
through them. Yeah.
So, think about how using your hands can help you grasp and explain like an abstract idea.
Right.
Something we'll actually come back to later with this idea of gesture.
Okay.
Or, setting up your workspace in a certain way can actually spark new thoughts.
Right.
Or even explaining something you've just learned to someone else that can solidify your own understanding of it and your memory of it.
I see.
So it's not just about kind of gritting our teeth and, concentrating harder with our brains, but it's about intelligently connecting with these external resources.
Right. And these limitations that we bump into when we're like, really trying to think hard,
Yeah.
it's not really about how smart you are.
Right.
Like, it's not like some people just have more brain power than others. It's really more about how our brains are wired.
That's a really crucial point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our brains are incredibly good at certain things, like sensing the world around us,
Okay.
moving our bodies, navigating physical spaces,
Yeah.
connecting with other people. Like these things often feel almost automatic to us.
Right.
But when it comes to, tasks that are really complex, like trying to remember lots of detailed information
Yeah.
or, strict logical reasoning or really trying to grasp a really abstract or counterintuitive concept, that's when we often hit a wall.
Right. And it's interesting how our understanding of the brain has kind of been shaped by like whatever the dominant technology of the time is.
Totally.
Like your sources mentioned this whole rise of the computer metaphor, like,
Yeah.
back with the ENI. People were just blown away by what this machine could do, like all these complex calculations.
Yeah, the New York Times article you shared really captures that.
Yeah.
Like the idea that this machine was so intelligent
Right.
that its creators had given up trying to find problems so long that they couldn't be solved.
Right.
It really fueled this whole notion of the brain as a kind of biological computer.
Right.
And even today, that computer analogy still really shapes the way we think and talk about our own mental processes.
Totally. But the computer's not the only analogy that's been influential.
Right, absolutely not. About 50 years after that,
Okay.
another idea started to gain traction, which was the brain as a muscle.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that 2002 study by Lisa Blackwell and Carol Dweck, where they gave seventh graders this article titled "New Research Shows That the Brain Can Be Developed Like a Muscle"?
Right.
What was so insightful about that study was they were investigating how our actual beliefs about the brain can affect our cognitive abilities. So by presenting the brain as something that can grow stronger with effort and practice, they were really looking at, the power of mindset
Right.
on learning and intellectual development.
Yeah.
So it's a very different way of thinking about the brain's potential compared to that sort of fixed capacity implied by the computer metaphor.
Okay, so maybe it's not just about having a better brain, but it's about how we use the brain we have and the resources that are available to us.
So,
And this leads to something your sources call extension inequality.
oh, this is so important.
Yeah.
Because our society, our education systems, our workplaces, they often operate on this underlying assumption that some people are just, naturally more intelligent than others.
Right.
That they have more of this like intelligence stuff inside their heads.
Right.
But the research on the extended mind offers a totally different perspective.
Okay. What's that perspective?
It suggests that some people appear to think more intelligently because they're actually better at extending their minds. And this could be because they have a better understanding of how to use these external resources.
Right.
Which is partly what we're exploring here today with you.
Yeah.
But crucially, it's about access.
Right.
It's about access to the very things that allow us to think well.
Things like being able to move your body,
Exactly.
having access to green spaces, being able to control your workspace, having those connections with knowledgeable experts and supportive peers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And those opportunities, as your sources emphasize, they're not equally distributed at all. So it really raises some really interesting questions about how access or the lack of access to these resources might be influencing,
Right.
the thinking of students, employees, our colleagues.
Everyone around us. Yeah.
It's not just about individual talent. It's about the environment and the resources that we can tap into.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's dive into some of these extra neural resources.
Yeah.
One of the first your sources highlight is this idea of thinking with sensations.
This idea of interoception, for anyone who hasn't come across that term before, what exactly is interoception?
So in simple terms, it's your awareness of the internal state of your body.
Okay.
So just like we have senses that gather information from the outside world, sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell,
Right.
we also have internal sensors that are constantly sending information to our brains about what's happening inside us.
Okay.
Signals from our organs, from our muscles, even from our bones.
Yeah.
You can think about it as your body is constantly talking to your brain.
And this information gets processed in a specific part of the brain, right? The insula?
Yes, and in the insula, that internal data is combined with other information.
Okay.
Our thoughts, memories, sensory input from the world around us to create a kind of overall picture of how we're feeling in the moment, our current physical state, even a sense of, what actions we might need to take to kind of maintain our internal equilibrium.
It's like our body's constantly giving us feedback. But we're not all equally good at picking up on these signals.
No, we're not.
Like, your sources mentioned this heartbeat detection test.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
So researchers use this to kind of assess interoceptive awareness.
Okay.
And they do it by simply asking people to count their heartbeats silently without touching their chest or wrist. And what they found is there's this surprisingly wide range in how accurate people are.
Okay.
Some individuals can be incredibly precise. They have this strong sense of their internal rhythms.
Oh, okay.
Others struggle to even feel their heartbeat at all.
Wow.
It really highlights how differently we all experience our own bodies.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And the sources share this anecdote about an interoception researcher at the London Science Museum
Oh, yeah.
who's giving this test to visitors.
Yeah.
There was this elderly couple that had really different experiences.
Yes. So Vivian Ainley, she asked each person to tell her when they felt their heart beating, while their pulse was being monitored by a sensor that only she could see.
Okay.
The elderly man could feel his heart beat really clearly, and he reported it accurately. But his wife couldn't feel it at all.
Wow.
Yeah. And it really underscored how unaware many of us are of this whole spectrum of internal awareness.
Right.
How much we tend to focus on these traditionally brain-based abilities, like remembering facts and figures, while overlooking this much more fundamental sense of our own bodies.
Yeah, but it turns out being aware of those internal sensations can actually really impact our thinking and our behavior.
Absolutely.
Your sources talk about this research on affect labeling.
Yes.
What is that?
This is where it becomes really practical for, managing our emotions and thinking more clearly.
Okay.
So research shows that just simply putting a label on how you're feeling, like saying to yourself, I feel anxious,
Right.
can actually reduce your physiological arousal, things like heart rate,
Mhm.
how much your skin conducts electricity.
Really just naming the feeling.
Exactly. It's like naming the emotion kind of takes some of its power away.
That's interesting. And brain scans actually back that up, right?
Yeah, they do. Brain scans show that naming feelings actually decreases activity in the amygdala,
Okay.
which is that part of the brain involved in, processing fear and other strong emotions, like your brain's alarm system, basically.
Right.
Interestingly, the research also found that dwelling on those feelings, really getting caught up in the story of why you feel a certain way,
Uh-huh.
can actually increase activity in the amygdala.
Oh, wow.
So it's the simple act of labeling, not analyzing,
Mhm.
that seems to bring a sense of calm.
So it's not about thinking it through, it's about just acknowledging it.
Exactly.
Interesting. And the sources also talk about the importance of being precise with our language
Yes.
when we label these feelings,
Yeah.
being as specific as possible.
Absolutely. So choosing really accurate and nuanced words to describe what we're feeling
Okay.
seems to be linked to making better decisions,
Mhm.
acting less impulsively, and even planning more successfully.
Wow.
It gives us a clearer sense of what we truly need and want in a given situation.
Yeah, it's almost like these internal sensations are like a compass,
Yes.
guiding us through choices we have to make.
But only if we can accurately read and interpret the signals.
Right. And here's a really surprising idea
Okay.
that came out of the research.
Yeah.
The body can actually be more rational
Yes.
than the brain.
This really throws people for a loop.
I know.
It brings in the research by John Coates with the financial traders.
Right.
The ones who are more attuned to their bodily signals.
Mm.
They actually made more profitable decisions as judged by the market
Wow.
compared to those who are less aware of their internal states.
It's so counterintuitive. You'd think financial decisions would be all about logic,
Yeah, like cold, hard logic up here in the brain.
Right, but you're saying it's more about the body.
Well, the suggestion here is that the body isn't as swayed by cognitive biases, those mental shortcuts and errors in thinking
Right.
that often cloud our conscious thought processes.
So sometimes paying attention to that gut feeling
Yeah,
might actually lead to a better outcome.
potentially, yeah.
So how do we get better at tuning into those bodily signals? The sources mention this idea of an interceptive journal.
This is a really practical technique.
Okay.
It involves keeping a record of the choices you make and how you felt when you were making them. So for each decision, you just jot down, a brief description of the decision, a really detailed account of the internal sensations you notice
Okay.
as you considered your options.
Okay.
And then the choice you ultimately made.
Right.
Any sensations that came up after you made the decision.
I see. So it's about making that connection between
Yes.
how you feel.
Consciously noting how you feel
Yeah.
as you imagine different possibilities, and then how you feel once you've acted.
And that can help us kind of decipher that language of the body.
Exactly.
Now, your sources also touch on how interoception relates to resilience.
Yes.
They mentioned Diana Nyad's experience with an MRI while anticipating and responding to breathing challenges
Yeah. Wasn't that fascinating?
during her swim.
Yeah.
I mean, that was amazing.
It was a great example.
Yeah.
And by observing, her brain activity under these different conditions,
Yeah.
researchers could investigate how she mentally prepared for and reacted to stressful situations.
Right. So how she was able to stay so resilient.
Exactly. And it connects to the research with those highly resilient soldiers who, much like those successful financial traders,
Right.
pay very close attention to early warning signs of stress in their bodies.
Interesting.
The idea is that by being aware of those subtle cues, you can avoid becoming overwhelmed and reacting impulsively.
So it's like catching those early whispers of stress before they become a shout.
Exactly.
And your sources mention things like mindfulness techniques
Yes.
as a way to cultivate this awareness. See, exactly.
Practices that really encourage you to pay attention to your present moment experience, including your bodily sensations, can be incredibly helpful in developing this kind of attunement.
Okay, so we've talked about thinking with sensations. Let's move on to another way. Our thinking kind of goes beyond the brain.
Yeah.
Thinking with movement.
Okay.
It seems like our traditional idea of sitting still to focus
Yeah.
might need a little updating.
Yeah, it's funny how much we associate thinking with being still, right?
Yeah.
But your sources really highlight these activity-permissive settings where movement is not only allowed but actually encouraged,
Uh-huh.
and how beneficial that can be for focus, especially when you compare them to, the traditional static learning and working environments.
Right.
They even suggest that what might look like fidgeting,
Yeah.
especially in children, could actually be a way that the body helps regulate alertness and manage anxiety,
Interesting.
as a form of self-regulation
Right.
through movement.
Yeah. So instead of trying to suppress all movement, maybe we should see it as our
Yeah.
bodies trying to help us concentrate.
Maybe so.
And then there's the research on exercise,
Oh, yes.
like the benefits of exercise.
Exercise is amazing for the brain.
I know. I mean, like moderate intensity exercise done for a reasonable amount of time
Yeah.
has been shown to improve our attention,
Oh.
our verbal fluency, our cognitive flexibility.
Yeah, problem-solving, decision-making memory.
It's a pretty comprehensive boost.
It is.
Yeah.
Even Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate in economics, noted how much clearer his thinking became during his 4-mile walks in Berkeley.
Wow.
So, it's not just like anecdotal evidence, it's like real.
Right.
And, the positive mental effects of moderate exercise can last for a couple of hours after you stop.
Wow. So we should all be like, walking around while we're thinking.
Maybe so.
Now, this idea of linking movement to learning is fascinating.
Yeah.
You mentioned the enactment effect.
Yeah.
What is that all about?
So the enactment effect basically means that we remember actions that we physically perform much better than things that we simply hear or see.
Okay.
So when we connect movement to new information,
Yeah.
it creates this richer, more memorable trace in our brains.
Mhm.
Plus, it engages both our procedural memory, how to do something, and our declarative memory, factual information,
Right.
which strengthens how well we recall it later.
So, like, for example, those professional actors,
Oh, yeah.
they memorize their lines for a play.
Yeah.
They often don't really try to learn the words
Right.
until they've blocked the play.
Until they know all their movements on stage.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the actors themselves will often report that the physical movements and the lines become really deeply connected in their minds,
Wow.
each reinforcing the other,
Right.
making recall much more reliable.
And this isn't just for actors, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Moved by Reading intervention shows how having children physically act out the stories they're reading can lead to these huge improvements in their reading comprehension.
So it's taking those abstract symbols and making them...
Yes, giving them a physical reality.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And it can even lead to a deeper level of understanding.
Absolutely.
Like in science classes.
Yes. So when demonstrations are used,
Mhm.
research indicates that students who actively participate physically
Right.
gain a much more profound, more internal understanding
Yeah.
than those who just passively watch.
I see.
As one education professor put it, learning is moving in new ways.
I love that. And then there's this idea of self-referential movements,
Yes.
where we consciously bring our own bodies into the intellectual process.
Exactly. So, like Einstein imagining himself riding on a beam of light
Right.
while he was developing the theory of relativity.
It seems so unconventional to put yourself at the center
Yeah.
of a scientific thought experiment like that.
Yeah. But, so many great thinkers have used this kind of embodied imagination.
I see.
Barbara McClintock, she described feeling like she was part of the system when she was examining chromosomes.
Wow.
Jonas Salk, the developer of the polio vaccine, pictured himself as a virus
Wow.
to better understand how it worked.
So it's like being it versus watching it.
Yes, exactly. And even something as simple as students, physically forming a triangle with their arms
Mm-hmm.
to understand its properties.
Right.
Those kinds of body-based activities can really deepen understanding and strengthen memory, even for abstract concepts.
Yeah, even math that we think of as
Right.
purely intellectual.
Right.
Yeah, so movement's not just good for our physical health. It's
No.
deeply connected to how we think, how we learn.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it can even be a catalyst for creativity.
Oh, tell me about that.
Yeah, the research suggests that, the simple act of moving through physical space can be a kind of metaphor for creative thinking,
Okay.
for exploring new perspectives and enabling dynamic change in our thought processes, which might explain why research has consistently found that people tend to be more creative
Okay.
during and immediately after walking
Right.
compared to when they're sitting still.
So we should all be having walking meetings.
Maybe so.
And it's not just the physical act of walking, it's about being in nature.
Yeah. Spending time in natural environments seems to evoke what's called soft fascination,
Okay.
which activates the brain's default mode network.
What is that?
This is that brain state
Yeah.
where our minds are less focused on specific tasks
Right?
and more open to making those unexpected connections and generating novel insights, key components of creativity.
So being in nature kind of like
Yes.
opens up those pathways.
It does.
Okay, so we've talked about how we think with our bodies through sensation and movement.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's move on to another way. Our thinking extends outward
Okay.
through gesture.
Okay.
It seems like something we do almost automatically,
Mm-hmm.
but it actually impacts how we understand and how we communicate.
Absolutely. And, your sources point to this idea of a gesture gap.
A gesture gap.
Yeah, the suggestion is that differences in how frequently and effectively parents use gestures
Right.
when interacting with their kids from different socioeconomic backgrounds might actually play a role in the children's vocabulary development.
Wow.
So it highlights how fundamental gesture is to communication and learning, really from a very early age.
That's fascinating. And research by Susan Goldenmeadow has shown that gestures often come before and even reveal our understanding of concepts, sometimes even before we can put those concepts into words.
Exactly. She's observed these mismatches between what people say and what they gesture when they're grappling with new ideas.
Yeah.
Whether it's kids working on conservation tasks or older students tackling math problems.
It's like our hands know before our brains do sometimes.
Yeah, it's like the hands are trying to express something that the words haven't quite caught up with.
And gesture seems to be particularly helpful when we're dealing with new or complex information.
Yes, especially when we're in that uncharted territory cognitively.
Right.
Remember that study with the biochemistry research group that was investigating thrombin?
Yeah.
And how the scientists used gestures to really support their tentative understandings as they were kind of working towards new discoveries.
Right. It's like their hands were shaping the knowledge.
Exactly.
And the sources also mention how sign language,
Oh, yes.
as a fully developed system of gestures,
Yeah,
can actually enhance visual and spatial thinking.
absolutely. People who are fluent in sign language, even hearing individuals who've learned it,
Okay.
tend to have this heightened ability to process visual and spatial information
Wow.
compared to those who don't know sign language.
So using those gestures regularly
Yeah.
strengthens those spatial
Exactly.
cognitive abilities.
Yeah, it's like a workout for your spatial skills.
Interesting. So how can we consciously use the power of gesture in our own thinking and learning?
Well, one simple way is to create more opportunities for gesturing. And the research mentions how improvisation,
Yeah.
having to kind of come up with explanations on the spot,
Right.
tends to increase our use of gesture. And one cognitive scientist, Wolf Michael Roth, he actually changed his teaching methods to specifically encourage students to describe and explain scientific concepts out loud in class,
Wow.
knowing that they would naturally rely on gesture
Right.
to help convey their understanding.
So it's almost like that act of trying to express yourself,
Mm-hmm.
even with your hands.
Even if you don't realize you're doing it,
Yeah.
helps to solidify your own comprehension.
And we can also get better at understanding others
Yes.
by paying attention to their gestures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Research has shown that we can train ourselves to pay more attention
Okay.
to the information that's being communicated through gesture.
Interesting.
Even just simple instructions like
Yeah.
focus on the shape, the movement, and the placement of somebody's hands can significantly improve our ability to pick up on those nuances and that emerging knowledge
I see.
that might not be fully expressed in their words.
So being more mindful of our own gestures and the gestures of others
Absolutely.
can help us understand
Yeah,
more fully.
totally. It could be another tool in our cognitive toolkit.
Now let's talk about our physical environment,
Okay.
both the natural world and the spaces we build,
Yeah.
how they can impact our thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Jackson Pollock's move to Long Island seems like a really good example.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah.
The sources describe how he was feeling increasingly overwhelmed by life in New York City and the natural environment of Long Island with its unique light, the open green spaces, the ocean breezes.
Yeah.
It had this really kind of calming
Okay.
yet stimulating effect on him.
Interesting.
This change in environment really led to a huge transformation in his life and in his artistic work.
And it's interesting to consider that even spaces that appear entirely natural,
Yes.
like Central Park in the middle of New York City.
They are often the result of really deliberate design.
Exactly. Frederick Law Olmsted's vision for Central Park was actually inspired by his visits to these carefully designed estates in England.
Wow.
It involved this massive undertaking to transform what was then a rather unpromising piece of land
Yeah.
into the iconic landscape we know today.
And now scientists are starting to really dig into the specific features of natural spaces
Yes.
that have those positive effects on us.
It's fascinating research. Researchers like Stephen Kaplan and Mark Berman
Mm-hmm.
have been working to identify these key ingredients of naturalness.
I love that the ingredients of naturalness.
Yeah, natural landscapes, they tend to have less variation in overall brightness, but richer color saturation.
Okay.
Fewer straight lines and more curves.
Right.
Those complex, densely clustered edges like the canopy of a tree.
Mm-hmm.
Other important features include dynamic but diffuse light.
Yeah.
Gentle rhythmic movement, like swaying leaves and soft repeating sounds like birdsong or flowing water. And these things have a pretty immediate impact on us both,
Yeah.
body and mind.
So within seconds of being in a natural setting,
Okay.
our heart rate tends to slow down. Our blood pressure drops.
Wow.
Our breathing becomes more regular. Our brain activity shifts to a more relaxed state.
That's amazing. And we even gaze longer at natural scenes
Yeah.
and blink less frequently.
Yeah,
Like our brains don't have to work as hard.
exactly.
And this has led to the growth of what's called biophilic design,
Yeah,
bringing those nature-inspired elements indoors.
Exactly. Studies have shown that incorporating things like potted plants,
Yeah.
natural materials like wood and stone,
Yeah.
even just having views of greenery from windows,
Yeah.
can yield similar cognitive benefits to actually being outdoors.
Mm-hmm.
Things like improved mood, reduced stress levels, even enhanced short-term memory.
But it's not just about those quick hits of nature, right?
Right. The longer exposure.
Longer exposures can have even more profound impact.
Yes. Exactly like naturalists. John Muir often wrote about those vast, calm, measureless mountain days.
Yeah.
And, extended time spent in nature seems to give us this more expansive sense of time. Wow. And can even foster a more optimistic outlook on the future, perhaps by reducing our arousal overall and increasing our capacity for sustained attention.
That's incredible. And going back to creativity, nature plays a big role there, too.
Yes, it
With children's imaginative play.
Yeah, it's often much richer and more elaborate outdoors.
Yeah. And for adults, spending time in nature can foster more innovative thinking.
Right, because it activates the default mode network,
Right.
that state of relaxed, undirected thought.
And there's that feeling of awe
Oh, yes, awe is powerful.
that we can experience in nature.
Yeah, that feeling seems to temporarily diminish activity in the brain regions associated with our sense of self in space,
Wow.
leading to this feeling of being part of something much larger than ourselves.
It's almost like a spiritual experience.
It can be.
Mm.
And, behaviorally, people tend to act more pro-socially and altruistically
Interesting.
after experiencing these awe-inspiring natural phenomena.
Wow.
Even astronauts describe this overview effect.
The overview effect.
Yeah, this really profound sense of interconnectedness and oneness
Wow.
when viewing Earth from the vastness of space.
So nature's like this powerful resource
Yes.
for our minds, but what about the built spaces?
Yeah, it's the spaces we create.
Where we spend most of our time.
Mm.
Do they have a similar impact on our thinking?
Absolutely. Your sources argue that they do, although often we underestimate or even overlook this influence.
Right.